This lecture will cover the theory of plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is the mechanism that describes all of the major changes that occur at Earth's surface, such as earthquakes, volcanoes, anything that is currently deforming the Earth's crust. So I have, starting off, a picture here, an aerial photo. You may recognize it. This is the San Andreas Fault. And living in Southern California, many of you are probably very familiar with this. And a lot of you, as noted in the discussion, have actually experienced many earthquakes because of the activity along the San Andreas. So the San Andreas Fault marks something called a plate boundary. That means that there's these two elements, these two large masses called tectonic plates. One plate is moving to the south, the other is moving to the north. And so you have this linear feature that denotes the boundary between the two plates. So if we were looking at a biology class, instead of talking about plate tectonics, we'd start with evolution, because evolution is what describes all of the main biological mechanisms of that science. And for geology, for earth science, that's plate tectonics. That describes everything that occurs at Earth's surface. So in a nutshell, plate tectonics is a theory. It describes the large-scale motion of Earth's tectonic plates, and the process is thought to have originated around 3 to 3.5 billion years ago, which is actually pretty interesting. It's the same time that microbial life evolved on this planet. Tectonic plates are part of the lithosphere, or the solid crust, and the upper mantle. And this lithosphere essentially floats on the underlying mantle, or asthenosphere. And the asthenosphere is partially molten, whereas the lithosphere, the plates, are solid. So the plates sort of raft on top of the molten asthenosphere. That plate movement, it's dictated by the gravitational forces associated with something called seafloor spreading. So here I really like this image. It shows Earth's interior, and then at the surface, the plate boundaries. Where plates are touching each other, you have this red line. So the San Andreas is one of these lines. It's a boundary between two different tectonic plates. So Earth's outer shell is broken up into these various tectonic plates. Each plate has its own speed and moves in its own direction. So where the plates are colliding, that's where the action is occurring. And that's where you're going to get a lot of earthquakes. So we live really close to a plate boundary. That's why we experience a lot of that energy. Whereas people who would live on the interior of plates, they never experience earthquakes. They don't have active volcanoes because simply that's not where any action is going on. So at the plate boundaries are where you have all of those special features such as volcanism, earthquakes. So Earth has about 12 major tectonic plates. And you don't have to memorize any of these numbers. It's just to give you an idea of the relative sizes between each. So here we can see we have the North American plate, the South American plate, the African plate. So many of the plates are named after the continents that they encompass. And one important thing to remember about this picture here is to notice that a tectonic plate can contain both continent and ocean. Right? So this is important because early on, back in the 50s, before plate tectonics was proven, people used to think that it was the continents that were moving. But it's not the continents that move, it's the plates that move. The continents are just rafting along for the ride. So remember that plates can contain both continental and oceanic crust. So where was this theory born? Well, it started off as a hypothesis in 1930. A meteorologist, his name was Alfred Wegener, he proposed a hypothesis called continental drift. And this was because he noticed that if you closed up all of the modern day oceans and you pushed all of the continents together, they actually fit in kind of a really interestingly, and seemingly it can't be a coincidence, right? How well they're fitting together into one giant supercontinent. So he proposed this hypothesis. He called it continental drift. And, the geologist hated it because, well, first of all, he was a meteorologist, right? He was a weatherman, and the geologist didn't think he had any business, coming into their science and telling them how it works. But the second was that he couldn't come up with a mechanism to describe how these giant continents could just move across the surface of the Earth, traversing oceans. And so that's why it remained a hypothesis. And he was laughed out of the scientific community and died a broken man. Because in the 1930s, we didn't have any scientific technology at our disposal to confirm his hypothesis. There was no way to test it. The mechanism was thought to be impossible. It didn't seem to obey the laws of physics. So early on, we talked about this in the first lecture of the scientific method, that hypothesis has to be testable. But we have to be able to test it and figure out if we're right or wrong. If we can't test the hypothesis, then it's pretty useless. Science is all about, the limits of what we can do. And if we can't prove something, then it's pretty much speculation. So after he died, geologists started to continue to find very interesting coincidences in the paleontological record. So this picture here, this is the skeletal remains of a Mesosaurus, or the marine dinosaur that existed. And paleontologists were unearthing these identical fossil assemblages on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean over in Western Africa and Eastern South America. And that seemed impossible. How could this species, which was not adapted to swim the entire length of oceans, how could there be such a rich species assemblage? It was almost as if these two continents were once connected, and you were looking at the historical remnants of the animals that existed on that supercontinent. So that was one of the first early indicators of plate tectonics. Some other early indicators included things like mountain chains. So geologists started noticing and discovering that mountain chains, once again, separated by an entire ocean on different continents, were of the same rock type, of the same age, of the same metamorphic grade. And it seemed too impossible. They must have once been linked, but how? Other things that they also unearthed were ore deposits and rock types of the same age and composition. More interestingly, they started to unearth the climatic evidence. So, for example, the geologists were finding a lot of glacial deposits at the equator. And that didn't make any sense, because we know that ice is at the poles, right? The North and South Pole is where we have our ice caps. But here was this evidence saying that that wasn't the case, 250 million years ago, that we actually had glaciers at the equator, the hot point of Earth. So that seemed impossible. The only way that could be is if the continent had moved, right? The continent had moved away. And on the other side, they were finding fossilized palm trees in Greenland. So Greenland, which we know is a cold climate, would never have palm trees, but yet they were finding them, unearthing them from that time period, 250 or so million years ago. So that may have indicated that Greenland was actually at one point at the equator, where it was warm, where palm trees could grow, so that the continents appear to be moving around the Earth, but nobody still knows how that's possible. How can you explain that? It wasn't until World War II, because war is always good for scientific advancement, because we're always trying to develop new and better ways of finding each other. And one of those techniques was something called sonar. So during WW2, they developed sonar to search for the enemy submarines at depth. And the sonar revealed something very strange, right? Up until this point, really, nobody had any ideas about the base and the topography of the ocean floor. It was sort of just thought to be this big, massive, flat plain. But what they found instead was the largest active volcanic mountain range in the world, running straight down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And that's named the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And this was huge. This was amazing. And it was the first real quantitative evidence that the geologic mechanisms we had to describe Earth weren't really that great, and that something was clearly going on. There was clearly this giant crack in the Earth, and lava was erupting, but we still really didn't have a way to explain that. So additional studies continue, technology continues to be developed, and they conducted seafloor drilling experiments. And what they found was along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, this ridge here that they discovered in World War II, they found that rocks right at the ridge were the youngest. right? They were also warm from being freshly erupted. And the further away you got from that ridge, the older and older and older the rocks got. And that was the first evidence for something called seafloor spreading. Seafloor spreading is where you have this tectonic rift zone. So you have a crack in the Earth's lithosphere. Magma is pushed upwards and then pushes the plates apart, right, due to gravity. So because of that, you'd have the young lava at the center, and it would be getting progressively older and cooler as it moved away from that ridge. So this process creates new ocean crust. So you can see over the next 250 million years, Africa and South America moved further and further away from each other from this mechanism called seafloor spreading. It's called a divergent plate boundary, and we'll discuss the various types. And there's a couple of videos here that you will watch to sort of see a visual of how the plates have actually moved from the past 300 million years to their present day position. So further along, scientists continue to develop, more techniques for spotting the submarines. So during the Cold War, yet another new technique was developed to search for these submarines. It's called MAD, or a magnetic anomaly detector. This was to look for the steel hulls of ships. And once again, they find something that they never expected and that at first they could not explain. They found alternating bands of opposite magnetic polarity moving away from these ocean spreading centers, these ridges. So basically, they found that the ocean floor was magnetized, the rocks that make up the ocean floor were magnetized, and also that magnetization flipped randomly at intervals away from the ridge. They also found that magnetic flipping was identical on both sides, sort of this magnetic barcode. And so that showed them that there was this spreading happening. And now, finally, with magnetically magnetized rocks, they have a way of quantifying this rate of spreading. But what they didn't understand is why they had alternating magnetic bands. So what happens is when the lava is erupted at the ridge, it's a liquid, and within the lava it has these tiny little magnetic minerals called magnetite. And when they're in the liquid state, they're free to align with the magnetic field, with the North Pole. And then once the lava cools, so here's a picture of once the lava cools, that magnetic direction is actually locked in. So it's like a fossil magnetization. So it's a record of where the North Pole was at the time the rock formed or was erupted at the center of the ocean. So that was the first time that they saw this magnetization, but also it proved that Earth's magnetic field actually reversed. So at some periods, the North Pole is where we currently know it to be. But at other times in the past, it pointed opposite, right? The North Pole was the South Pole. They were flipped. And so it seems to be some part of the natural plate tectonic cycle within Earth's mantle. Magnetic reversals were actually shown to be a normal part of having the structure that Earth does. So Earth has a massive magnetic field, and it's generated by the electrical current in the liquid iron outer core. So because Earth has this liquid iron core, it can generate this magnetic field. Whereas planets like Mars, Mars doesn't have a magnetic field anymore. It might have at one point in the past, but it doesn't have one now. So that's why geologists believe that Mars probably doesn't have a liquid iron outer core. Otherwise, it would be generating a magnetic field. So this is just a little physics 101, because anytime you have an electrical current, you always create a magnetic field that will be perpendicular to the current direction. So you can look at it this way. You have Earth's outer core, you have your liquid outer core, and here's the spin axis. So that's why the field lines come in here at the North Pole. So make sure you have a look at this clip as well. And a famous NASA simulation was also able to demonstrate that magnetic reversals are a natural part of Earth's system. We don't understand it super well, but we do know that it's natural and that it's been occurring for millions, if not maybe even billions of years. So the cool thing about magnetic reversals is that they happen pretty frequently, but you can't predict when they will occur. So that makes the barcode really unique. And so if you find a rock in Switzerland that has this barcode, and then you are looking at another continent, maybe you're in Australia and you find a rock that has the same magnetic barcode, then you know they existed at the same time because the magnetic field leaves that unique record, right? It's not a regular pattern, it's irregularly periodic. So the thing that really troubled people about Wagner's hypothesis was the fact that he didn't have a mechanism to describe continental drift. So his hypothesis, although very ingenious and close to what we know now about how the planets looked in the past, is actually not correct. Plate tectonics is the correct mechanism. So it's not the continents that moved, right? So he thought it was just the continents. He didn't know about the plates, right? So the plates encompass the continents. And because of that geophysical boundary we talked about between the solid upper crusted mantle and the molten lower mantle, right? The plates wrapped on top and move due to gravity. And plates also move pretty slow, only about the rate your fingernail grows, but some plates are faster than others. Some of the fast plates move up to 8 centimeters per year, whereas the really slow ones, less than a centimeter per year. So it's nothing that we can really notice. But the construction of Pangaea, so Pangaea was an ancient supercontinent. It existed from around 320 to 250 million years ago. And it incorporated the majority, or around 3/4 of all of Earth's continents. And it began to break up around 180 million years ago with the birth of the Atlantic Ocean. So a new seafloor spreading ridge, a new plate boundary was born here between Africa and South America, and then they began to move apart from that rift. So that occurred around 180 million years ago. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the mechanism, right? How does this work? How do plates move? So we have the lithosphere. All plates are made of lithosphere. They're cool, they're rigid, they're brittle. You can think about them like the boats on the ocean. The asthenosphere is the magma ocean that the plates float on top. It's warm, it's plastic, it's able to flow. So because of this difference, right, because of that thermodynamic boundary, you have the fact that these solid plates can float on top of a less solid. And it's important to know as well that the mantle, it's not a liquid, right? We're using that analogy because it works, but the mantle is mostly solid, but it's partially solid, right? So it's more liquid than the lithosphere, right? But the boundary exists nonetheless. So when we look at tectonic plates, we also have to think back when we look at Earth's layers. Remember, the crust is the outermost shell. And we have to understand that there's 2 different types of crust on Earth. The first type of crust is called continental crust, and it's made of something called granite. Granite is an igneous rock that cools slowly underground. Ocean crust is made of basalt. So they're fundamentally different. Ocean crust is born at spreading centers out in the ocean, where you have mantle material pushed up and cooling. So that mantle material is a lot different than the material in the crust that cools. So continental crust is much thicker, as you can see. It's buoyant. You cannot push it down into the mantle, it won't go. And it's much older than ocean crust. The oldest continental crust we have is up to 2.5 billion years old. And ocean crust, on the other hand, is much thinner. So you can see that here, and much denser. It's a lot younger because oceans are what are being constantly recycled here, right? Because the salt is so much denser, anytime plates collide, this ocean crust, because it's so much denser, it will sink down into the mantle and the continental crust will remain. So that's why continental crust is so much older, because every time they have to go to battle, continental crust, it remains at the surface, and ocean crust gets pushed down because there's a lot of pressure at these plate boundaries between different plates. So here we can see that analogy again. The tectonic plates are like the boat rafting on the ocean, or the asthenosphere. So a container ship that's empty is going to ride higher, whereas a container ship loaded with cargo is going to ride lower, right? So this is known as isostasy. So now we can look at, now that we understand why plates exist and the mechanisms there, now we can get into a little bit of the vocabulary of what happens when plates meet, right? That's where all the action is where the plates meet each other. So there's three different types of things that occur. You could have a transform boundary. So that's just where the plates are like sliding past each other. And that's what we have on the San Andreas Fault, right? We don't have a divergent plate boundary. That's where you have a crack in the Earth's lithosphere and the plates are moving away from each other. And so magma will rise up and you'll create a volcanic chain here. Convergent plate boundaries are the opposite of divergent. That's where plates are coming together and colliding. So one plate will be pushed down into the mantle, right? Whichever is the denser plate, the heavier plate, and the lighter plate will remain. And in this picture, you can see all three demonstrated, right? You can see you have a convergent plate boundary here, where continental crust meets ocean crust. The ocean crust gets pushed down. You have a divergent plate boundary out here. The two plates are moving away. You have the magma being pushed up. And you have transform plate boundaries. And actually, most transform occur in the ocean. It's really rare to have one, such as the San Andreas on land. Other than New Zealand, it's one of the very few. So the plates are made of lithosphere. That's the crust and upper mantle. They're rigid. The asthenosphere, remember, that's the lower mantle, and it's partially molten. Okay, so now we can look at each individually and talk about how they occur. So let's start with divergent plate boundaries. So divergent plate boundaries always begin as continental rifting. So think back to Pangaea, the supercontinent. It broke up 180 million years ago from a continental rifting between South America and Africa. So they eventually broke away from each other and this new plate boundary was formed. So that's how that starts. The tectonic plate basically splits itself in half. You get melting and faulting of the continental lithosphere. An example of where that's occurring today is actually the East African Rift. So in East Africa, they have currently a new plate boundary, a new ocean trying to be born. And over time, rainwater will fill in that rift valley and form a sea. And as the plates move apart, that sea gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it becomes something called an oceanic spreading center. So a new plate boundary and ocean form, and the rift valley evolves to a ridge or an active volcanic mountain chain. So one example we've already discussed was the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So pay attention to the symptoms here, because in your homeworks, in those quizzes, I asked you about this. What would you get at each type of plate boundary? So at continental rifting, you're going to get volcanoes, you're going to get earthquakes. Any time that magma can reach the surface, you get a volcano. Anytime you're at a plate boundary, you're definitely going to have earthquakes. So make sure you know that. Oceanic spreading center, right? You also have volcanoes and earthquakes. And what about convergent plate boundaries? So where plates converge on one another. So there's three different types that could occur. There's oceanic continental, oceanic, and continental. So when you have an oceanic continental plate collision, the ocean plate is always going to be the one that's subducted. So that's your vocabulary word, subduction. That's when one tectonic plate gets pushed down into the mantle. And anytime you have that occurring, anytime a plate is being pushed down, you're going to have melting, right? You have this foreign plate, it's being pushed down to the asthenosphere. It contains all of the, the dead skeletons of the animals and everything with it. And the water is going to lower the melting point of these rocks and cause melting, and it comes up at the surface as a volcano. So symptoms of these include volcanoes and earthquakes. And a really famous plate boundary is the Cascade Volcanics in the Pacific Northwest. The first one, if you move north in California, you could eventually hit Mount Shasta. That's the beginning of a ocean continental plate boundary where the San Andreas ends. You can also get two ocean plates meeting, and where that occurs, you're going to have the heavier ocean plate. This is also going to be the older plate because it's had more time to cool off, contract, and become denser. So wherever you have two ocean plates meet, the colder and the older plate will be subducted down into the mantle. And of course, you're going to have melting again. So you have both earthquakes and volcanism. The third type is continental plate collision. And so here when I was talking before about continental crust, how it's so different than ocean crust, it's so light and buoyant. It'll never be fully pushed down into the mantle enough to trigger volcanism, right? A little bit gets pushed down, but not enough. Most of it gets pushed up, and that's where you get these huge non-volcanic mountain ranges such as the Himalayas in India, because both plates are too buoyant to fully subduct. So instead, the crust is pushed upward instead of downward to form mountains. And the Himalayas are still growing even today. India continues colliding with the rest of Asia. So the Himalayas are only getting taller. So for symptoms, definitely earthquakes and faulting, but there's no volcanoes. Right? There's no volcanoes in the Himalayas. It's non-volcanic because nothing is being pushed down into the mantle. There's no, subduction occurring. And then the third type of plate boundary is transform. So transform can be either continental or oceanic. We know that we have the San Andreas is a continental transform plate boundary, right? So here you can imagine this as being the San Andreas Fault. Two different continental plates are just sliding past each other. They're not colliding or moving away. They're just sliding past. And so because of that, you get faulting and earthquakes, as you know, and mountain building, but there's no volcanoes because nothing is, as you can see, nothing is being pushed down to the mantle. They're just sliding past one another. So that's why we don't have an active volcano here in Los Angeles, right? And thank goodness. And then you also can get transform plate boundaries out in the ocean. That's where they most commonly occur, is actually in the ocean, because divergent plate boundaries, because Earth is a sphere, they don't make a straight line. The divergent plate boundaries, they're offset by these little transform faults. So two different oceanic plates will slide past each other, and they offset the spreading ridge. So the spreading ridge isn't a straight line. It's offset by these little transform faults. So your symptoms are going to include faulting and earthquakes. You can also get, because of this, these large features in the ocean called fracture zones, but I'm not going to touch too much on this right now. We're going to come back to this later when we have our Google Earth Plate Tectonics lab. Okay, and then this picture here, which I have to finish off the lecture, is a picture of where the majority of Earth's volcanoes and earthquakes occur. The blue dots being earthquakes and the red triangles being volcanoes. So what you may notice is that they all mainly occur on these lines, right? And then you have these big empty spaces of basically no activity. And what these outline are the plate boundaries. So remember, I said that plate boundaries are where all the action is happening, right? That's where you get melting. That's where you get all the friction and the energy. So that's another way we know where the plate boundaries are, is because that's where stuff is happening. That's where you're getting earthquakes. And occasionally you'll get some things that will occur within the plate. And that will be covered in the next lecture. These features called hotspots. They're not related to plate tectonics, so they're not included in this lecture here. But that's how we know, and make sure you watch all the other videos to accompany this, because they really go through how plate tectonics started as a hypothesis and finally evolved into a theory and scientific fact, and all the steps along the way that scientists used and all the evidence that they uncovered to be able to describe the mechanism effectively and be able to predict things.